The rhythmic thud of the steam hammers felt like a heartbeat until the world turned white. One moment, Marcus was checking a pressure gauge. The next, a localized thunderclap tore through the mill, and a tidal wave of molten steel surged across the floor like a hungry predator. Through a curtain of sapphire sparks and choking sulfur, he saw a young man's silhouette vanish behind a wall of liquid fire. The screams were instantly swallowed by the hiss of vaporizing lubricants, leaving nothing behind but the smell of scorched iron and a silence so heavy it pressed against his eardrums. Hours later, as the director spoke to the cameras about unavoidable human error, Marcus felt a cold weight in his pocket. A grease-stained journal he'd pulled from the ashes. He watched the cleanup crews pour fresh concrete over the site of the tragedy, their shovels working fast to bury the evidence under a thick gray slab. As his own friends and colleagues began to avert their eyes, Marcus realized the heat in the mill was nothing compared to the fire that was about to consume the city. He had 30 years of loyalty in his blood, but the ink on these pages told a story that could burn the entire empire to the ground. The heavy air of Gary, Indiana, clung to the lungs like a wet shroud, thick with the acrid stench of burnt rubber and the biting tang of sulfur. Marcus Caldwell stood before the North Star steel gatehouse, his fingers tracing the familiar ridges of a battered brass lighter in his pocket. The engraving, 30 years of loyalty, felt like a brand against his palm. Above him, the sky bled a bruised, dirty orange, the perpetual glow of the blast furnaces staining the clouds a sickly copper. The rhythmic thud of steam hammers vibrated through the soles of his work boots, a mechanical heartbeat that had dictated the tempo of his own life for 3 decades. This industrial groan was the only lullaby the city knew. Steel grit crunched underfoot as he adjusted his hard hat, feeling a bead of oily sweat track its way down his temple. Marcus stepped into the cavernous maw of the plant, where the atmosphere shifted from oppressive to incinerating. The heat hit him like a physical blow, searing the moisture from his eyes. He dragged a gloved hand across a control panel, his eyes scanning the steam pressure gauges with practiced ease. Behind the thick observation glass of the furnaces, the molten iron churned with a brilliance that defied the human eye. A sun trapped in a cage of brick and steel. He offered a curt nod to a pair of welders nearby, their torches spitting cascades of sapphire sparks into the soot-stained gloom. The roar of the turbines swallowed all speech, forcing Marcus to rely on sharp, economical gestures to direct his crew. He checked the tension on the ladle chains, his muscles coiled tight. Every breath tasted of scale and machine oil, the familiar incense of the night shift. He reached out and squeezed Gary Thompson's shoulder, noticing the way the boy's shoulder blade twitched under the heavy canvas of his coveralls. Marcus pointed toward the casting floor at the far end of the gallery, a section bathed in an ominous, flickering yellow radiance. Gary shifted his weight, his fingers fumbling with the bridge of his safety glasses as they slid down his nose. Marcus pressed a clipboard into his hands, the metal clip biting into the paper of the pouring schedule. Gary nodded, his mouth moving in a silent reply that was lost to the screech of the conveyor belt. Marcus watched the boy's knuckles turn a stark, bloodless white as he gripped the folder. The young man's figure soon dissolved into the shimmering heat haze of the gallery. Marcus turned back to his consoles, a quiet hope flickering in his chest that the kid would handle the night's volume without incident. A sound like a localized thunderclap, sharp and final, tore through the ambient roar of North Star steel. Marcus spun around just in time to see the steel casing on the casting line buckle and split like wet parchment. A tidal wave of liquid metal, white-hot and hungry, surged across the concrete floor, transforming the workspace into a screaming furnace. Brilliant droplets ricocheted off the overhead beams, eating through clothing and skin in a heartbeat. Marcus threw an arm over his face, shielding his eyes from a heat so intense it began to liquefy the plastic safety shields on the walls. The oxygen vanished, sucked out by the flash, replaced by a suffocating wall of acrid smoke. Human cries were instantly snuffed out by the hiss of vaporizing lubricants. The entire casting section vanished behind a curtain of flame and dancing sparks, leaving only a glowing mass of slag where a man had once stood. When the flames finally receded into a carpet of gray ash, Marcus picked his way through the smoking ruins. His boots melted slightly against the cooling concrete as he came to a halt before a shapeless, dark mass at the base of an overturned ladle. A single work boot, its sole fused into a blackened lump, protruded from beneath a twisted sheet of charred metal. Marcus dropped to his knees, the residual heat from the floor seeping through his heavy trousers. He stared at the mask of frozen terror etched into what remained of Gary's face, now a crust of soot and bone. Marcus's hands began to shake, a fine, uncontrollable tremor that started in his fingertips and raced up his arms. The realization that Gary was now nothing more than an incinerated shell hit him with the force of the explosion. The silence in the mill was a physical weight, pressing against his eardrums harder than the previous cacophony. He reached out and closed Gary's eyes, the taste of ash bitter on his tongue. By dawn, men in sharp, tailored suits were already unrolling yellow tape across the entrance to the casting bay. The director of North Star Steel stood before a phalanx of cameras, his voice smooth and rehearsed as he spoke the words "gross negligence" by the trainee. Marcus stood at the edge of the crowd, his fists clenching until his scars pulled tight. He looked at the official report being circulated, a document that blamed Gary for ignoring safety protocols he knew the boy had memorized. Plant security guards moved in, their movements practiced and rough as they shoved Marcus away from the sealed doors. He watched his fellow workers avert their eyes, their faces masks of calculated indifference born from the fear of the breadline. The overhead speakers crackled to life, announcing the immediate closure of the section. Marcus watched as fresh concrete was poured over the site of the accident. A gray, heavy slab, meant to bury the truth along with the boy. Marcus sat in the break room, his gaze fixed on the empty chair where Gary usually ate his lunch. He remembered the way the kid would check every valve 3 times, his brow furrowed in concentration, before the start of a pour. A memory flickered. Gary scribbling in a notebook every time a pipe rattled or a gauge vibrated out of rhythm. Marcus couldn't reconcile that meticulous nature with the image of a boy who would supposedly bypass a pressure valve. A cold, hard knot of suspicion settled in his gut. Through the window, he noticed a crew of supervisors hurriedly hauling away the mangled remains of the casting equipment under the cover of the gathering dusk. The version of events being fed to the press felt like a flimsy shroud, and a slow, burning rage began to push aside the grief in his chest. He pressed his back against the cold brick of the warehouse wall as a searchlight's beam swept over the gravel just inches above his head. Marcus waited for the security patrol's footsteps to fade before he moved. The screech of rusted chain-link wire grated on his nerves as he squeezed through a gap in the perimeter fence. He moved like a shadow, hugging the dark patches of the yard to avoid the cameras installed by the North Star board. His heart hammered against his ribs by the time he reached the olive drab door of the sealed bay. He snapped the plastic seal with a sharp tug, his breath hitching as he slipped inside. The darkness of the mill met him with the smell of old fire and abandonment. He clicked on a dim flashlight, keeping the beam low, sweeping the floor for what the cleanup crew might have missed. He dug through a pile of debris near Gary's locker, his fingers brushing against something solid and rectangular. He pulled an oil-stained journal from a hollow space beneath the floorboards, the cover slick with industrial grime. His hands shook as he flipped through the pages, seeing Gary's neat, cramped handwriting. There were detailed sketches of hairline fractures in the cooling system, each dated and noted with a record of a complaint filed. Marcus read the underlined passages where Gary described the critical wear on the pipes. Warnings the masters had ordered him to ignore. The boy had logged every single failure of the automated systems. Marcus pulled the journal to his chest, the weight of it feeling like a death sentence for the reputation of North Star Steel. A sharp shout from a guard shattered the stillness. A beam from a high-powered flashlight hit Marcus squarely in the eyes, blinding him. He bolted to the left, nearly tripping over a length of jagged rebar. The heavy, rhythmic thud of boots echoed off the high rafters as the chase began. Marcus dove into an open maintenance hatch, the rough concrete skinning his elbows as he scrambled into the dark. He crawled through the narrow, lightless tunnel, gagging on the thick dust and the smell of damp earth. Behind him, the metallic screech of a grate being wrenched open told him they were close. He slid down a slick drainage pipe, tumbling into a stagnant ditch outside the plant's perimeter. He scrambled to his feet and vanished into the midnight fog of Gary, clutching the journal like a holy relic. Marcus locked his apartment door, turning all 3 deadbolts before dropping the heavy curtains over the windows. A single lamp on the kitchen table provided the only light as he spread out Gary's records. He pored over the technical reports the boy had copied in secret, his eyes widening at the figures that detailed exactly how much the board had saved by skipping safety upgrades. He saw the signatures of the directors at the bottom of orders that mandated continued casting despite failing sensors. Cold sweat broke out across his forehead. Every page of the journal was a scream of premeditated negligence. He realized then that Gary had been a dead man, walking from his very first shift, and North Star Steel had simply turned his death into a convenient tax write-off. He stared at the journal for a long time, his gaze drifting to the brass lighter on the table. He knew that bringing this truth to light would incinerate his own career and erase the pension he had spent 30 years earning. Yet, the memory of Gary's face, frozen in that final moment of terror, wouldn't let him turn away. Marcus threw open the heavy oak doors of the executive suite, the air inside smelling of expensive tobacco and the sterile chill of high-end air conditioning. Director Eldridge didn't even bother to look up from his monitor until Marcus slammed a gray, photocopied sheet onto the polished mahogany surface. On the paper, Gary's sketches and his notes about the faulty pressure sensors were impossible to ignore. Marcus leaned forward, his palms flat against the desk, feeling the pulse thrumming in his neck. His eyes were locked on Eldridge's face, watching as the man's skin turned a mottled, angry red. Marcus demanded the investigation be reopened, his voice, raspy from years of inhaling mill dust, hitting the quiet room like a sledgehammer. Eldridge reached out with 2 fingers, picked up the copy, and fed it into the narrow slot of a paper shredder. Marcus listened to the dry, mechanical crunch as the evidence was reduced to confetti. The director leaned back, adjusting his gold cufflinks, and calmly informed Marcus that his termination papers were already being processed. Marcus watched the cold, practiced smirk on the man's face as he explained that Marcus's entire pension fund was now officially nullified. The room felt like a pressurized chamber, the ticking of the wall clock counting down the final seconds of a 30-year life. Marcus turned on his heel and walked out into the hallway without waiting for security, a hollow, echoing void opening up in his chest. He took his usual shortcut through the 5th bay, the familiar hum of the machinery a backdrop to his thoughts, when a sharp, metallic screech erupted from above. Marcus dove behind the massive cast-iron base of a milling machine, just as a multi-ton steel beam slammed into the concrete a yard from his feet. A cloud of pulverized cement filled his mouth, and the vibration of the impact rattled his teeth. He looked up to see a frayed cable end, the cut unnaturally clean, swinging lazily in the rafters. His heart hammered against his ribs as he brushed the white dust from his hard hat. He peered into the gloom of the upper tiers, but he saw only the retreating shadows of workers vanishing into the catwalks. Marcus slipped into the restricted emergency block, hiding behind the rusted casings of the decommissioned turbines. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the camera app. He aimed the lens at a fresh coat of silver paint that poorly masked the deep, spider-webbing cracks in the main housing unit. The flash illuminated the jagged edges of the metal that North Star had tried to hide with cheap lacquer. His fingers brushed the sticky surface, feeling the cold, jagged void of a cavity beneath the paint. He took a series of photos, capturing every piece of evidence of the company's lethal thrift. The thrum of nearby machinery forced him to stay low, his breath hitching until he saw the upload confirmation on his screen. He noticed the shift in the air as he moved back toward the main floor. Groups of workers were huddled together, whispering and pointing in his direction. The head of plant security stood in the center of a circle of steelworkers, waving a stack of papers bearing an environmental group's logo. Marcus caught the glint of hatred in the eyes of men he had shared shifts with for a lifetime. Snatches of conversation drifted to him, words like plant closure and starving families. He realized the administration had successfully rebranded his search for the truth as an act of sabotage against the town's only paycheck. The atmosphere around him thickened with an unspoken accusation, and Marcus felt a wall of invisible concrete rising between himself and the men he called brothers. In the cafeteria, Marcus picked up a tray of lukewarm mash and headed for his usual spot by the window. Frank, a friend for 20 years, caught sight of him and shoved his chair back with a violent screech. Following Frank's lead, the rest of the table stood up in unison, creating a vacuum of empty seats and the clatter of dropped silverware. Marcus stood alone in the center of the hall, the weight of hundreds of silent, judgmental stares pressing against him. The usual roar of the lunchroom died instantly, replaced by a heavy, suffocating stillness. He slowly sat down, staring into his tray, while a loud, wet spit hit the floor just behind his back. The sun was dipping below the rusted horizon as Marcus walked out to the parking lot. His path was blocked by 4 young men in North Star jackets, their faces obscured by the shadows of their caps, their hands gripping heavy tire irons. He heard the long, hissing sigh of escaping air as one of them drove a blade into the front tire of his old pickup. Insults were hurled at him like stones, mixed with clods of oily dirt. He saw no reason in their eyes, only the primal fear of men who didn't know how they would feed their kids if the mill went dark. He walked slowly around the vehicle, clutching his bag to his side as one of the men brought a fist down on the hood, leaving a deep dent in the metal. Marcus opened his front door and found his son, Daniel, sitting on the floor of the entryway. The sleeve of the boy's jacket was torn away, and a purple bruise was blooming under his eye, smeared with the dust of the schoolyard. Marcus dropped to his knees, but Daniel pulled away, his chest heaving as he fought back tears. The boy told him how the other kids, the sons of the men Marcus worked with, had hunted him down at recess, screaming the word rat. Marcus felt something inside him snap at the sight of his son's shaking shoulders. He reached out to touch the boy's hair, but Daniel flinched, asking in a small, broken voice if it was true that Marcus was going to get them run out of town. Eleanor stood on the porch, her hand trembling as she pointed at a plastic gas can sitting on the top step. The smell of gasoline was sharp and overwhelming, the yellow liquid soaking into the wood beneath Marcus's boots. She grabbed the front of his jacket, her eyes wide with a raw, primal terror for their home. She begged him to go get the journal and burn it right there in the yard, to just make it go away. Marcus looked at the darkened windows of the houses across the street, where he could see the silhouettes of his neighbors watching from behind their curtains. The smell of fuel seemed to cling to his skin, and Eleanor's tears felt hotter than the molten spray from the casting floor. He went back to the plant one last time to clear out his locker, but he stopped short when he saw the hunched back of his best friend, Tommy Reynolds. Tommy was prying at the lock of Marcus's locker with a heavy screwdriver, the metal groaning under the strain. Marcus watched the betrayal in the mirror of the adjacent row. Tommy turned around, and his face was a mask of shame and desperation. He stammered that the bosses had promised him a supervisor's spot if he could find the dead kid's book. Marcus looked at Tommy's hands, the hands that had helped him pull an engine 3 weeks ago, and realized that in Gary, loyalty was just another commodity that had been sold for scrap. The main street was a gauntlet of posters. On every utility pole, Marcus saw his own face staring back at him from grainy, black and white flyers under the heading, "Enemy of the City." He saw the union stamp in the corner, a call for a total boycott of his family. People quickened their pace as he approached, and shopkeepers turned their open signs to closed before he could reach the door. He ripped one of the flyers down, the sticky adhesive clinging to his fingers like tar. The entire city of Gary had become a single, hostile organism, its heartbeat controlled by the North Star front office. And Marcus finally understood the true depth of his isolation. Marcus was hammering boards over the first-floor windows, while Eleanor hurried Daniel into the basement. Outside, a low, rhythmic growl of voices was growing louder, accompanied by the heavy tramp of boots on the pavement. He peered through a gap in the blinds and saw a sea of familiar faces. Neighbors, co-workers, all clutching signs and stones. The first rock shattered the glass, showering Marcus in a spray of razor-sharp shards. He heard the screams from the street, a mob demanding he leave the city or face the consequences. Marcus pressed his palm against the vibrating wall, the wood humming with the collective rage of the crowd outside. The house, usually a sanctuary, felt like a frail cage. Through the gaps in the boarded windows, a discordant chorus of hundreds of voices bled into the room, chanting for jobs and bread. The sound was a monolithic roar that drowned out the distant sirens of the city. He saw the silhouettes of union banners dancing against the streetlights, their shadows flickering across the faded wallpaper of his living room. The air inside turned stale, heavy with the scent of sweat and tobacco smoke drifting in from the porch. Every shout from the mob felt like a physical blow to the back of his head, a rhythmic pulse of hatred that made the floorboards tremble. Eleanor gripped Daniel's shoulders so hard her knuckles were white as bone. The boy squeezed his eyes shut, burying his face in the soft fabric of his mother's robe. A sudden, deafening crack echoed through the house as a heavy chunk of granite smashed through a pine board, bringing a spray of splinters with it. The rock tumbled across the hardwood floor, gouging a deep scar into the wood and kicking up a cloud of gray dust. Eleanor let out a sharp cry, shielding Daniel with her own body as glass fragments hissed through the air. The dust settled on the boy's eyelashes, making him cough and wheeze. Eleanor retreated into the darkest corner of the room, her eyes wide as the house continued to groan under the assault. Marcus reached for the shelf and clicked the heavy toggle on his old Zenith radio. The speaker spat out a burst of static before an official, measured voice cut through the noise. He froze, listening to an emergency bulletin about a federal inspection motorcade arriving at Gary's Central Square. Through the crackle, he heard the names of Washington officials, men sent to investigate the mounting safety complaints. The amber glow of the radio dial reflected in Marcus's eyes as the announcer described the police cordons and the growing crowds at City Hall. The cold fear in his gut was suddenly replaced by a sharp, icy focus. The radio voice drowned in another wave of static and the roar of the mob outside, but the message had been received. He dropped to his knees in front of the fireplace, his fingers searching for the loose brick in the side of the hearth. He pulled it free, revealing the oil-stained journal of Gary Thompson, wrapped tightly in heavy plastic alongside a small black flash drive. He traced the outline of the book, the uneven texture of the paper beneath the plastic feeling like a live wire. Marcus unzipped his heavy work jacket and shoved the evidence into a deep inner pocket, right against his chest. The weight of the journal felt more substantial than any weapon he could have carried. He patted his chest, confirming the zipper was secure, the sharp edge of the drive digging into his rib. He was no longer just a man. He was a vessel for a truth that could level the city. Marcus took Eleanor's face in his rough, calloused hands and pressed a dry, quick kiss to her forehead. She tried to grab his sleeve, her eyes pleading, but he gently pulled away and pointed toward the heavy cellar door. He waited until she and Daniel had disappeared into the darkness of the basement before sliding the heavy bolt home. He took a final look at the barricaded front door, which was bowing under the weight of the men outside. He tightened the laces on his boots and took a deep breath of the acrid air. His shoulders squared as he moved toward the back exit, leaving the warmth of his home for the predatory shadows of the night. He threw open the back door, and the cold, damp air of Gary hit him like a bucket of water. Marcus vaulted over the low fence and sprinted through the narrow alleys between the tool sheds, where the shadows were thick and smelled of wet earth. A glass bottle shattered nearby, spraying his boots with cheap beer and jagged shards. He saw the silhouettes of neighbors in the upstairs windows, their fingers pointing at his retreating form. The smoke from burning tires in nearby yards stung his eyes, blurring his vision as he dodged between lines of hanging laundry and overflowing trash cans. The tramp of feet followed him, a heavy, relentless sound. He burst out of the alleyway onto the edge of the factory square, his lungs burning with every stride. Marcus skidded onto the square, which was flooded by the harsh, white glare of industrial spotlights. Near the entrance of the administration building, the black, armored SUVs of the federal inspectors sat idling. Director Eldridge stood on the concrete steps, flanked by his lieutenants, and raised a hand to point at the approaching figure. Eldridge's face twisted into a mask of theatrical pity as he shouted to the inspectors about a grief-stricken, unstable employee. Marcus saw the men in the long wool coats turn, their eyes taking in his torn clothes and the soot smeared across his face. Eldridge's voice, amplified by a megaphone, boomed across the plaza, painting Marcus as a traitor and a madman for the benefit of the Washington elite. A wall of men in North Star coveralls surged forward, cutting off Marcus's path to the government vehicles. He found himself trapped in a living ring of bodies that smelled of machine grease and old, fermented anger. Elbows slammed into his ribs, knocking the wind out of him and forcing him back. He looked into the snarling faces of men he had shared 1,000 lunch breaks with. The circle tightened, shoving him back into the shadows and away from the sight of the federal agents. Rough hands grabbed at his jacket, trying to trip him and pull him down to the asphalt. The roar of the crowd became a mindless, vibrating hum that threatened to swallow him whole. Tommy Reynolds stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the last gap in the circle. In Tommy's hand, a heavy pipe wrench glinted dully, his knuckles white as he gripped the handle. He raised the tool, his shadow falling long and dark over Marcus's face. Tommy's voice broke as he demanded the bag, the sound thick with a mixture of shame and desperation. Marcus saw the tremor in Tommy's chin, but the cold steel of the wrench remained poised inches from his temple. The surrounding workers went quiet, watching the confrontation between the two oldest friends in the plant. Marcus could smell the stale whiskey on Tommy's breath and saw the look of a man who had been promised a future he didn't deserve. Marcus stood tall, looking directly into Tommy's bloodshot eyes. He took a breath that felt like it came from the very bottom of his boots. His voice, tempered by decades of shouting over the roar of the furnaces, cut through the silence of the square. He shouted Gary's name. Then he shouted the name of old Tom, who had been cooked by a steam leak 5 years prior. He began to recite the names of the men whose deaths the North Star board had buried under accidental labels. Tommy's arm began to sag, the wrench lowering as the weight of those names hit him. Marcus saw the workers in the circle begin to look at one another, their grips on his jacket loosening. The silence spread like a ripple in a pond as Marcus continued to name the ghosts of the mill. Two security guards in black North Star uniforms shoved through the thinning crowd, their batons drawn. They moved with a practiced, clinical efficiency, intending to pin Marcus's arms behind his back under the cover of the renewed shouting. One guard drove a fist into Marcus's gut, doubling him over. Marcus felt the gloved fingers clawing at his jacket, reaching for the pocket where the journal was hidden. Marcus arched his back as the baton grazed his ribs, and with a sudden, violent twist, he lunged forward. The guard's fingers slipped off the oily fabric of his jacket, leaving a jagged tear in the shoulder. He tucked his chin and charged across the open asphalt, ignoring the searing fire in his lungs. The slap of his boots echoed through the square, a frantic rhythm that brought him closer to the polished black flank of the lead SUV. The wind whistled in his ears, drowning out the shouts of the men behind him. He saw his own frantic reflection in the tinted glass and threw his entire weight into a final, desperate leap, eluding the outstretched hands of the security team. He ripped Gary's journal from his jacket, the yellowed pages fanning out like a wing in the air. The book landed with a heavy thud on the hood of the lead car, sliding across the lacquer until it hit the base of the windshield. Marcus hit the ground hard, skidding on his elbows, but his eyes never left the man behind the glass. The lead inspector froze, staring at the oil-stained diagrams and Gary's frantic red notations through the windshield. The journal sat there, vibrating with the idle of the engine. Marcus breathed in great, ragged gulps of air, his forehead pressed to the cold pavement, his fingers still twitching from the force of the throw. The inspector opened the heavy door and stepped out, reaching for the journal with the tips of his fingers. Marcus watched as the official flipped through the pages, the sound of the paper crisp and loud in the sudden stillness of the square. Eldridge's guards stood frozen, their batons half raised, their eyes darting to the television cameras that were now swiveling to capture the moment. Eldridge himself took a step forward, but his foot caught in a crack in the pavement, ruining his poise. Marcus saw the inspector point to a diagram of the cooling system, then beckon an assistant with a digital recorder. The flash of a dozen cameras blinded Marcus, turning the scene into a series of jagged, white-hot snapshots. Marcus pushed himself up from the ground, brushing the gray grit from his palms. He looked directly at Director Eldridge, whose face had taken on the color of wet chalk. A single bead of sweat tracked down Eldridge's temple, disappearing into his starched collar. The federal team was already huddled over the photos Marcus had taken of the cracks in the turbines. Eldridge tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but no sound came out. Marcus felt a strange, detached calm as he watched the facade of the director's power crumble. The cold wind ruffled Marcus's hair, smelling of ozone and rain, as Eldridge finally lowered his head. The roar of the square died away as a metallic, synthesized voice boomed from the SUV's PA system. Marcus watched the hundreds of workers go still as the order was given to immediately seal all digital and paper archives of North Star Steel. The silence that followed was so absolute that he could hear the ticking of cooling metal from the nearby shops. Men in blue coveralls slowly lowered their signs, their shoulders sagging as the reality of the situation set in. The lights in the executive windows began to wink out, one by one. The echo of the federal order vibrated in the air long after the voice stopped, leaving the workers staring at their empty hands. Marcus pushed open the heavy glass doors of the administration building, the cold morning light of Gary spilling across the floor. He gripped a yellow envelope, his formal termination for actions detrimental to the corporation. The papers smelled of fresh ink and bureaucratic finality. He looked at the years of service column, now marked with a thick black line that erased 3 decades of his life. The hallways of North Star felt cavernous and hollow, the warmth of the human element stripped away. He walked down the front steps, feeling the wind catch the envelope and tug at his fingers. His career was a handful of ash, drifting away as he passed the empty guard shack. He walked down the center of the main street, the wind kicking up old newspapers and empty soda cans. On the massive iron gates of North Star, fresh white notices with red federal seals were already fluttering. He read the words, "mandatory restructuring," a phrase that he knew meant nothing but long lines at the unemployment office for the rest of the town. The neon signs of the bars and shops seemed to have dimmed, their purpose gone without the factory whistle to guide them. He watched a flatbed truck hauling a piece of heavy machinery out of the yard, leaving deep, muddy ruts in the earth. The city was falling into a deep, fitful sleep. A group of workers, including Tom, turned sharply into an alleyway the moment they spotted him. Marcus heard the wet, heavy sound of someone spitting on the asphalt, and the noise felt like a physical strike. His former friends quickened their pace, burying their faces in their collars as if he were carrying a plague. The word Judas drifted back to him, muffled by the groan of a distant freight train. He stopped in the middle of the road, looking at the empty space between him and the men he had known since they were boys. His loneliness was a thick layer of soot, something that couldn't be scrubbed away. Marcus pushed open the gate to his house, the metal screeching on a single rusted hinge. Inside, the air smelled of lemon soap and fresh pine. Eleanor was standing on a ladder, her arm moving in a steady rhythm as she scrubbed the black smoke stains from the wall above the fireplace. Marcus picked up a hammer and fitted a new, resin-scented board against the frame of the broken window. Daniel was there, silent and focused, handing him the nails one by one. The rhythmic thud of the hammer filled the living room, a new heartbeat for the house. Eleanor turned around, her face smudged with plaster dust, and for the first time in weeks, the terror was gone from her eyes. He walked out to the end of a salt-crusted pier on Lake Michigan. The water was the color of cold steel, the waves licking at the rotting pilings with a soft, rhythmic hiss. He sat on the edge, his legs dangling over the dark water, and took a breath. The air out here was piercingly clean, free of sulfur and the fine metallic grit of the mill. He closed his eyes, listening to the cry of the gulls instead of the screech of the conveyor belts. The spray hit his face, cold and sharp, washing away the last of the factory fatigue. His lungs felt wide, as if they were finally remembering how to breathe without the weight of the city on them. A light touch on his shoulder made him turn. Gary's mother stood there in a black wool coat, her face a map of deep, permanent sorrow. She sat down beside him on the pier without a word, laying her thin, knotted hand over his wide, scarred palm. Marcus felt the warmth of her skin and the slight tremor in her fingers. She looked out at the horizon where the gray water met the gray sky, and in her eyes, he saw a quiet, profound gratitude that required no speech. They sat there for a long time, the silence of the lake wrapping around them, and Marcus knew that Gary's name was finally clean.